Welcome, dear listener, to The Silent Archives, where the sea and sky hold secrets that time has not diminished, where routine missions became eternal mysteries. Tonight, we journey not to ancient lands or museum galleries, but to the waters off Florida's coast on a December afternoon, when 5 aircraft and 14 men vanished into the gathering dusk, never to be seen again. As you settle into comfort, allowing the tensions of your day to gradually release their hold, know that you are safe here, in this space we share. The story I'm about to tell you is one of genuine mystery from the modern age, a puzzle that has captivated investigators, aviation experts, and those drawn to the unexplained for nearly 80 years. Yet in its telling, there is a strange piece. A reminder that even in our age of technology and communication, the world can still swallow secrets whole, and that sometimes the most profound mysteries are those that begin with the ordinary. Take a gentle breath with me now. Feel yourself becoming more comfortable with each passing moment. The world outside can wait. Here, in these archives of sleeping stories, time moves differently. We can stand on a Florida airfield in December of 1945, watch aircraft taxi for takeoff, hear engines roar to life, and follow a training flight that should have lasted 3 hours but has lasted nearly 8 decades in mystery. Before we begin our journey to that December day, to an afternoon when the world was finally at peace after years of war, let's take a few moments to prepare ourselves for the story ahead. Close your eyes if you haven't already, and imagine yourself standing near a runway as the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon. The year doesn't matter just yet. Time itself seems to pause here, waiting patiently for you to be ready. Feel the warmth of late afternoon sun on your skin. That particular quality of December light in Florida. Golden and soft, despite the calendar saying winter. The air carries the salt scent of the nearby ocean, mixed with the smell of aviation fuel and engine oil. The characteristic odors of any military airfield. These smells would have been even more pronounced in 1945, when engines ran on high-octane gasoline, and the air around runways shimmered with fuel vapors and exhaust. In the distance, you can hear the rhythmic sound of aircraft engines, that deep, powerful thrumming that was the soundtrack of the 1940s, when propeller planes ruled the skies and the world was learning to navigate by new technologies. The sound of a radial engine is distinctive, a growling, pulsing rhythm that aviators of that era knew as intimately as their own heartbeats. Each cylinder firing in sequence created a music of power and purpose, a sound that meant reliability and strength. Breathe in slowly, matching your breath to the patient rhythm of waves on distant shores. In through your nose, feeling the warm air fill your lungs, carrying with it the salt and sun and fuel smell of an airfield by the sea. A moment at the top of your breath, then release gently through your mouth. Like the tides themselves, your breathing finds its natural pace, constant and calm, ebbing and flowing like the waters that would claim our story's subjects. The aircraft we're exploring tonight are called TBM Avengers, torpedo bombers that served with distinction during World War II. They were substantial machines, weighing over 10,000 pounds empty and capable of carrying a 2,000-pound torpedo or equivalent bomb load. Each Avenger had a wingspan of over 50 feet and was powered by a Wright R-2600 Cyclone engine, producing 1,400 horsepower. They were not small or fragile aircraft. They were robust, proven, reliable machines that had survived combat operations across the Pacific Theater. But before we arrive at that moment, when 5 of them taxied down the runway for what should have been routine training, let yourself simply be present with the timeless quality of the sea and sky, of horizons where earth and ocean and atmosphere meet in ways that can confuse even experienced eyes. The boundary between ocean and sky can sometimes disappear in certain light, creating what aviators call spatial disorientation, where up and down become uncertain, where the reliable references of earthbound life no longer apply. Picture the ocean from high above, that vast expanse of blue and green, deceptively simple from a distance, but infinitely complex up close. The Atlantic waters off Florida's coast look peaceful in fair weather, inviting even. Shallow banks glow turquoise in the sunlight. Deeper channels appear navy blue. Small islands scatter across the seascape like green jewels on blue silk. From 3,000 feet, it all looks navigable, comprehensible, safe, but beneath that calm surface lie strong currents, sudden squalls, depths that have claimed countless vessels and aircraft over the centuries. The Gulf Stream, one of the ocean's most powerful currents, flows through these waters at speeds up to 5 miles per hour, capable of moving debris and wreckage dozens of miles from where it initially entered the water. Much like the mystery we're about to explore, some things appear straightforward until you're lost within them, and then every direction looks the same. Your body continues to relax, growing heavier and more comfortable with each breath. Any remaining tension in your shoulders melts away like clouds dissolving in evening light. Your jaw unclenches, your forehead smooths. Your hands rest gently, no longer gripping or holding anything, simply existing in peaceful stillness. You are becoming part of the eternal rhythm of sea and sky, where pilots have navigated for generations, where some found their way home and others did not. Now, as we prepare to step into our story, remember that you can drift away at any time. The narrative will continue. My voice, a gentle current that can carry you into sleep whenever you're ready. There's no need to remember every detail, no test at the end, no requirement to stay alert through every moment. Simply let the story wash over you like waves on a past, distant shore, taking from it whatever feels right for you tonight. Let the words become texture rather than content, a soft blanket of sound to accompany your journey into rest. Our story begins on December 5th, 1945, just 4 months after the end of World War II. The war in Europe had ended in May with Germany's surrender, the war in the Pacific in August with Japan's capitulation following, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world was finally at peace after 6 years of global conflict that had killed tens of millions, reshaped borders, destroyed cities, and fundamentally altered human civilization. Young men who had fought in both theaters were coming home, trading military service for civilian lives, starting families, pursuing educations, building the post-war world. The military was transitioning from wartime operations, peacetime training, and readiness, maintaining forces but at reduced strength, converting from combat operations to the routine of training and preparation that occupies peacetime armed forces. Naval Air Station, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, was one of many military installations along the Atlantic coast engaged in this transition. It was a training facility, a place where pilots learned the skills they would need for naval aviation in this new peacetime world. The base sat near the coast, with easy access to the open ocean, making it ideal for overwater navigation training, bombing practice, and the various exercises that prepared aviators for carrier operations and maritime patrol. The base had opened in 1942 as part of the massive expansion of military infrastructure during the war. It had trained thousands of pilots and aircrew, sent them off to war, and welcomed many of them back. Now, in December of 45, it was training a new generation. Young men who had mostly missed the war or seen only its final stages, learning skills they hoped they'd never need in combat but trained to use them if necessary. The physical layout of the base was typical of military installations of the era. Runways stretched across flat Florida terrain. Hangars housed dozens of aircraft. Barracks provided accommodation for the personnel stationed there. Administrative buildings handled the endless paperwork that military operations require, and along the perimeter, looking out over the Atlantic, were control towers and radio facilities that maintained contact with aircraft during training. Flights. The base was busy that December day. Multiple flights were scheduled, training exercises that took advantage of good weather. Aircraft lined the tarmac, their propellers gleaming in the afternoon sun, their aluminum skin reflecting light. Their distinctive silhouettes marking them as tools of war, transitioning to tools of training. Mechanics performed final checks, walking around each aircraft, checking fuel levels and tire pressure, ensuring control surfaces moved freely, verifying that everything was as it should be before flight. Pilots reviewed their flight plans in briefing rooms, studying charts that showed the planned route, discussing navigation techniques, reviewing procedures for various situations. They would fly by compass heading and dead reckoning, calculating position based on speed and time, using visual landmarks when available. This was standard navigation for all the era, proven and reliable when done correctly, but always requiring attention and care. Among these scheduled flights was one designated Flight 19. It consisted of 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, robust aircraft that had proven themselves during the war, particularly in the Pacific Theater, where they had delivered torpedoes against Japanese shipping and supported amphibious operations. The Avenger was a large plane by single-engine standards, with a crew of 3, pilot, turret gunner, and radio man. Each crew member had specific responsibilities, and together they made the aircraft an effective weapons platform, though on this December day, their weapons would be only practice bombs, inert metal shapes used for training. The 5 aircraft of Flight 19 were manned by 14 men in total. One plane carried only a 2-man crew. That day, pilot and gunner, the radio man position unfilled for reasons lost to history. These were mostly young men, students, learning navigation and the complexities of overwater flying. Many had limited experience with this particular training route, though they had completed basic flight training and were qualified to fly the Avenger. They were at that stage of training where they were competent but not yet experienced, capable but not yet confident, still learning the thousands of small details that separate adequate pilots from excellent ones. They trusted their flight leader, as military training requires and as common sense suggests. The flight leader was responsible for navigation, for making decisions, for guiding the formation safely through the exercise and back to base. The students would follow, maintaining formation, learning by observation and practice, building the experience that would eventually make them leaders themselves. The flight leader was Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, an experienced pilot who had seen combat during the war. Taylor had logged thousands of flight hours, had flown combat missions in the Pacific Theater, and was qualified to lead training missions. He was 31 years old, a veteran, someone who had proven himself in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. By all accounts, he was a competent and conscientious pilot, someone students could trust to bring them home safely. However, Taylor was relatively new to the Fort Lauderdale base, having arrived only recently. He was not deeply familiar with the local geography, the particular landmarks and features that local pilots knew intimately. He had not flown this exact training route many times before. This lack of local familiarity would prove significant in ways no one could have anticipated that afternoon, though at the time it seemed unremarkable. Pilots transferred between bases routinely, and qualified pilots were expected to adapt to new areas. The mission assigned to Flight 19 was called Navigation Problem Number 1. It was a routine exercise, one that other flights had completed successfully many times before. The training officers at Fort Lauderdale had designed a route that provided good practice in overwater navigation while remaining within reasonable range of the coast. challenging enough to be educational, but not so difficult as to be dangerous, assuming normal conditions and competent execution. The flight plan was triangular, a geometric pattern that would take the aircraft out over the ocean and back. The aircraft would fly east from Fort Lauderdale to an area called Hen and Chickens Shoals, a series of shallow banks and small islands about 65 miles from the coast. There they would conduct bombing practice with dummy bombs, inert devices that would allow them to practice the procedures for delivering ordnance without the expense and danger of live explosives. Then they would fly north toward Great Stirrup Cay in the Bahamas, following the chain of islands for a distance, getting practice in identifying landmarks from the air and using them for navigation. Finally, they would turn southwest to return to base, a direct flight back to Fort Lauderdale. The entire flight was expected to take about 3 hours, with an estimated return time around 5:30 in the afternoon, well before sunset, which, on December 5th in South Florida, came around 6 o'clock. It was a clear plan, well established, using landmarks and navigation techniques that were standard for the time. The Avenger aircraft had magnetic compasses and gyro compasses, 2 independent systems for determining direction. Pilots could also navigate by visible landmarks during daylight hours, using the distinctive shapes and colors of islands and event shallow banks to confirm their position. The flight would remain within relatively easy range of the coast, never venturing so far out that land would be beyond reach. It should have been straightforward, unremarkable, just another day of training in a peaceful world. At 2:10 in the afternoon, the 5 Avengers roared down the runway and lifted into the Florida sky. The sound of 5 radial engines at full throttle would have been tremendous, a wall of sound that shook the air and announced the flight's departure to everyone on the base. One by one, the heavy aircraft accelerated down the runway, their tails lifting as speed built. Then, rising into the air with the distinctive grace of machines built for flight, despite their substantial weight. The weather was fair. Visibility was good by the standards of the time. There were some clouds, some haze, but nothing that appeared threatening. The forecast called for deteriorating conditions later in the day, as was common in South Florida, where afternoon thunderstorms could develop quickly. But at takeoff time, conditions seemed acceptable for the planned flight. The crews would have noted the weather, evaluated it according to their training, and judged it suitable for the mission. The planes formed up after takeoff, the student pilots positioning themselves relative to Taylor's lead aircraft, maintaining the proper spacing and altitude, settling into the formation that they would fly for the exercise. From the bruised ground, watching 5 Avengers in formation was an impressive sight, a demonstration of coordinated power and purpose. The kind of display that made naval aviation such a fearsome force during the war. Behind them, Fort Lauderdale's coastline gradually diminished as they flew east over the Atlantic. The developed areas near the coast gave way to the turquoise waters that characterize the shallow banks and reefs of South Florida. Ahead lay the open ocean, beautiful and vast and deceptively simple to navigate. The Atlantic stretched to the horizon in every direction, an expanse of blue under blue, water under sky, with no obvious landmarks except where shallow banks and small islands interrupted the pattern. For the first part of the flight, everything proceeded normally. The aircraft reached Hen and Chickens Shoals, a bombing practice area marked by shallow waters and small islands, visible as lighter patches in the darker ocean. The distinctive shapes of these shoals had made them a useful landmark for navigation, easily identifiable from the air. The crews conducted their practice runs, lining up their approaches, releasing their dummy bombs, observing where they struck the water, practicing the coordination and timing that would be necessary if these were real combat missions. The practice bombing likely took 30 to 45 minutes, with each aircraft making multiple passes, each crew getting multiple opportunities to practice their procedures. It was routine training, the kind of exercise that built muscle, memory and confidence, preparing aircrews for missions they hoped they'd never have to fly for real. And then, practice. Complete, they turned north, following the flight plan, heading toward the next waypoint on their triangular route. But somewhere in this leg of the journey, something went wrong. The exact moment when confusion began is impossible to pinpoint from the historical record, but by mid-afternoon, radio communications from Flight 19 began to indicate problems. Lieutenant Taylor, the flight leader, started to sound uncertain about his position. His transmissions, picked up by ground stations and other aircraft, suggested growing concern about navigation, about where exactly the flight was located. The first clear indication of trouble came around 3:40 in the afternoon, about an hour and a half after takeoff. Taylor contacted another aircraft in the area, saying his compasses appeared to be malfunctioning. Both of his compasses, the gyro compass and the magnetic compass, seemed to be giving him unreliable or confusing readings. This was unusual but not impossible. Compasses could fail, could be affected by electrical problems or by local magnetic anomalies, or simply by mechanical issues, though having both fail simultaneously was rare enough to be concerning. Without reliable compass readings, Taylor had to navigate by visual landmarks and dead reckoning, calculating position based on time, speed, and last known location. This was a skill all pilots learned, a backup method for when instruments failed or were unavailable. But dead reckoning required knowing your starting point with certainty, and Taylor had become uncertain about where that starting point was. Looking down at the islands and waters below, trying to match what he saw with his mental map of the area, he believed he was over the Florida Keys, the chain of islands that curves southwest from the tip of Florida into the Gulf of Mexico. If this belief were true, if Flight 19 were indeed over the Florida Keys, then the correct action would be to fly north to reach the Florida mainland, then follow the coast northeast back to Fort Lauderdale. This would have been sound navigation based on that assumption. The Keys are distinctive from the air, a chain of islands separated by channels, surrounded by shallow waters that show as distinctive shades of green and turquoise. But Taylor was not over the Florida Keys. The evidence suggests strongly that he was actually over the Bahamas, the chain of islands that lies east and northeast of Florida, separated from the coast by the Florida Strait. The Bahamas and the Florida Keys do share some visual similarities when viewed from the air, particularly for someone not intimately familiar with both areas. Both are low-lying islands surrounded by shallow waters that appear as distinctive shades of blue and green. Both have similar vegetation, from several thousand feet in the air, especially with some haze reducing visibility. The two areas could be confused. To a pilot who was uncertain of his position and whose compasses were giving unreliable readings, this confusion was understandable but potentially fatal. If Taylor was over the Bahamas and believed he was over the Keys, then flying north as he intended would take him further out over the Atlantic, away from Florida, into open ocean with no landmarks, and no easy way to determine position. Instead of flying towards safety, he would be flying away from it, with each passing minute making the situation more desperate as fuel burned and options diminished. The other pilots in the formation began to express their own confusion and concern. Radio transmissions captured their growing uncertainty, their questions, their suggestions. Some of the student pilots believed they should fly west, back toward where they knew Florida must be, using basic logic that said the sun sets in the west and Florida is west of the Bahamas. But Taylor, as flight leader, made the decisions, and the training these young men had received emphasized following orders, trusting their leader, maintaining formation discipline even when doubts arose. This is one of the tragic ironies of the Flight 19 story. The students may have been right. Flying west would have brought them to Florida's east coast within an hour, perhaps less. But military discipline and the reasonable assumption that their experienced leader knew better than they did kept them in formation, following Taylor's commands, suppressing their doubts in favor of trust in authority and experience. Ground stations at Fort Lauderdale and other locations picked up these increasingly troubled transmissions. Controllers tried to provide guidance, tried to help Taylor determine his position and steer toward safety. They asked questions about what landmarks were visible, what the sun's position was, whether they could see any identifiable features. They transmitted headings that should bring the flight toward shore, basic compass courses that would provide a margin of safety even if position was uncertain. But radio communications were difficult. The aircraft were far enough away that transmissions were sometimes garbled or weak, breaking up with static, cutting in and out. Taylor's radio was having problems, adding another layer of difficulty to an already complex situation. Communication was intermittent at best. The ground controllers could hear some of what was being said but couldn't always transmit clearly back to the flight. They were talking to men in distress, but unable to effectively help them, listening to disaster unfold without ability to prevent it. As the afternoon wore on, as minutes accumulated into hours, the transmissions from Flight 19 became more desperate, more confused, more fragmented. Taylor believed with increasing conviction that he was over the Gulf of Mexico, having somehow flown too far west over the Florida Peninsula. Operating under this mistaken belief, he turned the flight east, thinking this would bring them back to Florida's east coast and to safety. In reality, this took them even further out over the Atlantic, deeper into trouble, further from any hope of finding land before fuel ran out. The other pilots expressed confusion with increasing urgency. Some suggested they should turn west, directly, contradicting Taylor's assessment. Others simply expressed bewilderment, saying nothing looked right, that they couldn't tell where they were, that the islands and waters below didn't match what they expected to see. But Taylor maintained his course, committed to his interpretation of their position, believing that his decisions would bring them home even as those decisions carried them further into danger. The weather began to deteriorate, adding another layer of crisis to an already desperate situation. What had been a clear afternoon with some clouds gave way to more extensive cloud cover and eventually to stormy conditions. Decreased as haze and clouds obscured landmarks. The wind picked up, creating chop on the ocean surface that made visual references less distinct. And as afternoon transitioned toward evening, the light began to change. Shadows lengthening, the golden hour approaching when everything takes on different colors and depth perception becomes more difficult. The sun, which might have provided a definitive clue to direction in the late afternoon, became obscured by clouds. If Taylor could have seen the sun setting clearly to the west, if he could have used that most basic of navigational references, he might have realized his error, might have understood that his assumptions about position were wrong. But the sun was hidden, and with it went the most reliable natural compass available to any aviator. The ocean below became rougher, more menacing, as wind and weather stirred the surface. What had been inviting, turquoise and blue waters, now appeared gray and hostile. Waves visible even from altitude. Whitecaps, indicating wind and current. And still the 5 aircraft flew on, burning fuel with every passing minute. Would tell them where they were, hoping to find their way back to land before fuel exhaustion made a water landing. Inevitable. By 6 o'clock in the evening, more than 4 hours after takeoff, the situation had become critical beyond any hope of normal resolution. The aircraft should have returned to base more than half an hour earlier. They had been flying far, longer than their fuel would normally allow, though the Avenger had significant endurance and could stay aloft for many hours under the right conditions. But eventually, inevitably, fuel would run out. The laws of physics don't care about confusion or desperation. Empty tanks mean engines stop and aircraft fall. The fuel gauge is perhaps the most unforgiving instrument in any aircraft. It measures reality without sentiment, counts down to zero without pause or mercy. As the needles dropped and the tanks emptied, the crews of Flight 19 would have watched with growing horror, knowing what those falling numbers meant, understanding that time was running out, not in some abstract sense, but in the most concrete way possible. The last intelligible radio transmission from Flight 19 came around 6:20 in the evening, nearly 4:01, half hours after takeoff. The message was fragmentary, broken by static and distance and deteriorating conditions, but its content was chilling in its hopelessness. A voice, impossible now to identify which pilot spoke, said they couldn't tell where they were, that nothing made sense, that everything looked wrong. They were sure they were over the Keys, but nothing matched what they expected to see. Then, silence. No more transmissions were received from any of the 5 aircraft. Somewhere in the darkening sky, over the vast Atlantic, Flight 19 had disappeared. Whether the aircraft went down together or separately, whether the crews survived the initial impact with the water, whether they managed to deploy life rafts and survival equipment, all of can't. This is unknown. The ocean keeps its secrets, and Flight 19's final moments remain a mystery known only to those who experienced them and to the sea that claimed them. But the story of that December day was not yet finished. The tragedy was about to deepen, the loss about to multiply. When Flight 19 failed to return and radio contact was lost, Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale immediately launched search and rescue operations. Multiple aircraft were dispatched to search the waters where the missing flight might have gone down, following likely paths based on the radio transmissions, calculating possible positions based on fuel and time and known directions. Ships at sea were alerted to watch for any sign of aircraft or survivors. Coast Guard stations along the Florida coast scanned the horizons with binoculars, looking for flares or debris, or any indication of where the missing aircraft might be. Everyone hoped to find the 5 Avengers, hoped to rescue the 14 men aboard them, hoped that somehow they had managed to ditch successfully and were waiting in life rafts for help to arrive. Among the search aircraft scrambled that evening was a PBM Mariner, a large twin-engine seaplane often used for search and rescue missions. The PBM was an impressive aircraft, nicknamed the Flying Boat for its ability to land on and take off from water. It had a crew of 13, needed multiple people to operate all its systems, had bunks and a small galley for extended missions, could stay aloft for hours, scanning vast areas of ocean. It was the kind of aircraft perfectly suited for search and rescue, designed to find people in distress and capable of landing on water to pick them up, if conditions allowed. The PBM took off at approximately 7:30 in the evening, shortly after dark, heading toward the area where Flight 19 was believed to have been last heard from. The crew would have been briefed on the situation, would have understood that 14 men were lost, and depending on them, would have been motivated by the universal brotherhood of aviators to find and rescue their comrades. Search and rescue crews are special people, willing to fly in dangerous conditions to help others, accepting risks that others won't. But the PBM Mariner never returned. Approximately 20 minutes after takeoff, while the search aircraft was still climbing toward its patrol altitude and heading out over the ocean, ships in the area reported seeing a massive explosion in the sky. Multiple witnesses, sailors on different vessels, all reported the same thing. A sudden ball of flame in the sky, darkness, bright enough to be seen for miles. A brief inferno that lit up the night sky before falling into the ocean, winking out. The PBM was never heard from again. No distress calls, no radio transmissions, no indication that the crew had any warning or opportunity to respond. One moment, they were flying a search pattern, scanning the dark waters for any sign of the missing bombers, and the next they were gone, consumed by an explosion that killed all 13 men aboard, transformed instantly from rescuers to victims, from searchers to searched for. All 13 men aboard the Mariner died, almost certainly instantly or so quickly that there was no time for consciousness of what was happening. The explosion that ripped their aircraft apart would have been catastrophic. Total, leaving nothing intact, giving no chance for survival or escape. For them, there was no prolonged struggle against the ocean. No hours of fear and fading hope. One moment, existence. The next, oblivion. Their families would later be told that death had been instantaneous, meant as consolation, though nothing truly consoles such loss. In a single afternoon and evening, 27 men had disappeared. Flight 19's 14 crew members were lost somewhere over the Atlantic. The PBM's 13 crew members died trying to find them. 27 families would receive telegrams. 27 futures were erased. 27 chairs would sit empty at Christmas dinners that year, just weeks away, and one of the most enduring mysteries in aviation history had been born, though no one yet knew how famous and controversial this December day would become. The search for Flight 19 and the PBM Mariner became one of the largest air-sea search operations in history up to that point. The scope was massive, reflecting both the military's commitment to its personnel and the genuine belief that survivors might still be found. For days, dozens of aircraft and ships combed hundreds of thousands of square miles of ocean. They searched the areas where the flights were thought to have been, followed possible drift patterns based on currents and winds, looked systematically for any debris, any sign of wreckage, any indication of what had happened to 6 aircraft and 27 men. The search efforts were heroic, systematic, thorough. Aircraft flew grid patterns over the ocean, spending hours at low altitude searching for any anomaly on the surface. Ships steamed back and forth, sailors scanning the water with binoculars, looking for anything that might indicate where the aircraft had gone down. Coast Guard stations maintained watch. Radio stations broadcast messages asking any ships in the area to report anything suspicious or unusual. The military spared no effort in trying to find the missing men, but they found nothing definitive. Some debris was recovered from the ocean over the following days. Pieces of aircraft and equipment that could have come from the missing planes, but none of it could be conclusively linked to Flight 19 or the PBM Mariner. The ocean had yielded some of its contents, but not the specific evidence needed to determine what had happened or where the aircraft had gone down. The search continued for days, then weeks, gradually scaling back as the probability of finding survivors diminished to zero, as the focus shifted from rescue to recovery, from hope to documentation. The official investigation began almost immediately, running in parallel with the search efforts. The U.S. Navy convened a board of inquiry in early 1946 to examine what had happened, to determine the cause of the loss, to identify any failures or problems that might be corrected to prevent similar tragedies in the future, to learn whatever lessons this disaster might teach. Naval aviation had lost aircraft and crews before, would lose them again. But each loss was examined thoroughly, each tragedy studied for preventable causes. The investigation was exhaustive by the standards of its time. Investigators interviewed everyone who had any contact with Flight 19 that day. Mechanics who serviced the aircraft, weather officers who briefed the crews, radio operators who heard the transmissions, other pilots who were in the air that afternoon. They examined maintenance records for all 5 aircraft, looking for any indication of mechanical problems. They analyzed the radio transcripts, studying every word recorded from Flight 19's communications, trying to reconstruct the flight's path and the progression of confusion. They reviewed the flight plan, examined weather records, consulted with navigation experts about how someone could become disoriented in that area. They looked at Taylor's record, his experience and qualifications, trying to understand how an experienced combat pilot could become so lost. They considered compass malfunction, radio problems, human error, environmental factors, everything that might have contributed to the tragedy. The initial conclusion of the Board of Inquiry was stark and unsatisfying. Cause unknown. Despite all the investigation, despite all the evidence examined and witnesses interviewed, the board could not determine with certainty what had happened to Flight 19. The aircraft were gone without trace. The ocean had hidden its secrets too well. Too much was unknown. Too many possibilities existed. Too little physical evidence survived to draw firm conclusions. The families, all of the lost men, would have to live without definitive answers about what had happened to their loved ones. Later, under pressure to provide more specific conclusions, the report was amended. The Navy's revised conclusion attributed the loss primarily to navigational error combined with deteriorating weather and eventual fuel exhaustion. The evidence, circumstantial though it was, suggested that Lieutenant Taylor had become disoriented, had made incorrect assumptions about the flight's position based on visual similarities between the Bahamas and the Florida Keys, and had led the formation progressively further from safety, despite the concerns and suggestions expressed by some of his crew. Eventually, running out of fuel after flying for hours beyond their planned return time, the aircraft would have been forced to ditch in the ocean. By the time fuel exhaustion occurred, darkness had fallen and weather had deteriorated. The ocean was rough with waves several feet high. These were the worst possible conditions for a water landing, virtually, guaranteeing that aircraft would break apart on impact. That crews would have little chance to deploy survival equipment, that survival in the water would be measured in minutes rather than hours. The Avenger was not designed for water landings. It was too heavy, with too high a wing loading, to settle gently onto ocean swells. When an Avenger ditched, it typically hit hard, often breaking apart, sometimes sinking almost immediately. Even if crews survived the initial impact, getting out of a rapidly sinking aircraft in darkness and rough seas presented enormous challenges. The water temperature in December would not cause immediate hypothermia, but would still be cold enough to sap strength quickly. Without rescue within hours, survival was unlikely even if the ditching was successful. As for the TBM Mariner, the likely explanation for its loss was a mid-air explosion caused by fuel leak and fire. The conclusion was based on the eyewitness reports from ships that had seen the explosion. The timing of the event shortly after takeoff, when fuel tanks would have been full, and the aircraft's known vulnerability to this type of accident. PBM had a reputation among aviators as being prone to fuel leaks and fires. Its nickname among crews was often the flying gas tank. Because of this vulnerability, a darkly humorous acknowledgement of the aircraft's most dangerous characteristic. Fuel vapors from a leak could accumulate in the aircraft's hull, needing only a spark to ignite. An electrical, short, static, discharge, or even a cigarette could provide that spark. The resulting explosion would be catastrophic, total, leaving no time for the crew to react or escape. This explanation fit the observed facts. The sudden bright explosion, seen by multiple witnesses. The complete lack of any distress call or attempt to communicate problems. The absence of any survivors or recoverable wreckage. These conclusions were reasonable, supported by what evidence existed: navigational error, equipment malfunction, deteriorating weather, fuel exhaustion, and in the PBM's case, the aircraft's known tendency toward catastrophic fires, formed a plausible explanation for why 6 aircraft failed to return that December day. An explanation, but not proof. Without wreckage, without bodies, without any physical evidence beyond radio transcripts and witness statements, certainty was impossible. The families of the lost men had explanations but not closure, theories but not facts, probabilities but not definitive knowledge. Lieutenant Taylor's role in the disaster became a point of painful discussion and controversy that extended for years. Investigation, particularly in its revised form, suggested his decisions, made under extreme stress and based on incorrect assumptions about position, had doomed the flight. He had rejected suggestions to turn west. He had maintained course toward what he thought was safety, but was actually deeper into danger. His compass problems, whether real or imagined, had eliminated his most reliable navigation tools, and he had been unable to navigate successfully without them. Some defended Taylor vigorously. Compass malfunction, if it truly occurred, would challenge any pilot. The visual similarities between the Bahamas and Florida Keys were real. The confusion, understandable. Taylor had been placed in an impossible situation through no fault of his own, and any pilot might have made similar errors under similar conditions. He was a combat veteran, had proven his skill and courage, and deserved better than to be blamed for a tragedy that involved multiple contributing factors beyond his control. Others were more critical, suggesting that a more experienced pilot familiar with the local area would have recognized the Bahamas for what they were, would have realized that flying east was wrong, would have accepted the guidance being transmitted from ground stations rather than trusting his own mistaken assessment. Some suggested that Taylor's relative unfamiliarity with the Fort Lauderdale area was a contributing factor, that he should not have been leading students over water when he himself lacked extensive local knowledge. Taylor's mother fought for years to clear her son's name, arguing passionately that equipment failure rather than pilot error was the primary cause of the tragedy. She wrote letters, petitioned officials, sought reviews of the findings. Her grief and determination eventually led the Navy to soften its language in the official report, changing the conclusion back to the more ambiguous cause unknown, rather than explicitly citing pilot error. This satisfied no one completely, but acknowledged the impossibility of certainty when the physical evidence had vanished beneath Atlantic waves. The truth, as is often the case, probably lies somewhere in the middle of these positions. Taylor faced a genuinely difficult situation. His compasses apparently malfunctioned, removing his most reliable navigation tools. The visual similarities between the Bahamas and the Keys were real. The weather deteriorated. Radio communications were problematic. Under these circumstances, mistakes were perhaps inevitable. But his decisions, however understandable, did lead the flight away from safety. Whether another pilot would have done better is impossible to know. We can only observe that Taylor made the choices he did, and those choices had fatal consequences. And there the matter might have rested, a tragic training accident, one of many incidents where military aircraft were lost during the dangerous work of aviation in an era when flying was still relatively new and inherently risky. The families would grieve. The Navy would implement whatever procedural changes seemed appropriate. And eventually, the incident would fade into the archives, remembered by those directly affected but largely forgotten by the wider world. But Flight 19's disappearance would not remain merely a footnote in aviation history. Instead, it would become the cornerstone of one of the 20th century's most famous mysteries, linked forever with a name that still evokes wonder and speculation, that still appears in documentaries and books and conversations about the unexplained. The Bermuda Triangle. The Bermuda Triangle, also known as the Devil's Triangle, is the name given to a loosely defined area of the Atlantic Ocean roughly bounded by Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. The 3 points of this triangle enclose approximately 500,000 square miles of ocean, though different sources define the boundaries slightly differently. Within this triangle, according to popular legend, Ships and aircraft have disappeared under mysterious circumstances, vanishing without explanation, defying natural laws, suggesting perhaps something supernatural or extraterrestrial, or simply unknown at work in these waters. Flight 19 became the central story, the foundational legend, in the Bermuda Triangle mythology. Its disappearance seemed to fit a mysterious pattern. Experienced pilots, modern aircraft, reasonable initial conditions, sudden loss of state, communication, complete absence of wreckage. The loss of the TBM Mariner added another layer to the mystery, suggesting that even rescue aircraft were not safe in this supposedly cursed region. Together, the two incidents on a single day created a story that seemed to demand explanation beyond the conventional. The Bermuda Triangle concept did not emerge immediately after Flight 19's disappearance. In 1945, and for years afterward, the incident was understood as a tragic accident, not as evidence of something paranormal. But in the 1950s and 60s, writers began collecting stories of disappearances in the region, noting patterns, suggesting connections, proposing that something unusual was happening in this part of the Atlantic. Articles in magazines, books about unsolved mysteries, television documentaries, all began featuring the Bermuda Triangle as a location where normal rules didn't apply, where ships and planes vanished for reasons that conventional science couldn't explain. Each retelling added more incidents, more disappearances, more speculation about causes. Some writers proposed magnetic anomalies that disabled compasses and instruments. Others suggested methane gas, eruptions from the ocean floor that could sink ships or bring down aircraft. Still others ventured into more exotic territory, alien abductions, time warps, portals to other dimensions, lost civilizations like Atlantis, affecting the area with ancient technology. The most influential popularizer of the Bermuda Triangle was Charles Berlitz, whose 1974 book, The Bermuda Triangle, became an international phenomenon, a bestseller that was translated into dozens of languages and sold millions of copies worldwide. Berlitz was a linguist and writer who had previously written about other mysteries and unexplained phenomena. His Triangle book brought together dozens of incidents in a single narrative, with them as evidence of something genuinely mysterious happening in this region of ocean. Berlitz presented Flight 19 as one of many inexplicable disappearances in the area, suggesting that conventional explanations like navigational error and bad weather were inadequate, that something stranger must be at work. His book was compelling, well-written, filled with dramatic accounts of ships and planes vanishing without trace, of final radio, messages cut off in mid-sentence, of searches that found nothing where something should have been. But Berlitz's book, and others like it, often contained inaccuracies, exaggerations, or omissions that made the stories more mysterious than the documented facts would support. Some accounts claimed that Taylor's last words were about entering white water or encountering strange phenomena, suggesting he had seen something extraordinary before disappearing. Others implied the weather was perfect and that nothing could explain the loss under such ideal conditions. Some suggested the flight had encountered something that disabled all their instruments simultaneously, some force or field that rendered navigation impossible. These dramatic additions made for compelling reading but didn't match the documentary evidence from the actual investigation. The radio transcripts show confusion about position and compass problems, but nothing about strange phenomena or white water or mysterious forces. The weather was fair at departure but deteriorated, as documented in weather records. The compasses apparently malfunctioned on Taylor's aircraft, but there's no evidence that all 5 aircraft simultaneously lost all their instruments. The reality, as we've explored, was more mundane but no less tragic. A combination of compass malfunction, navigational confusion due to visual similarities between island chains, deteriorating weather, problematic radio, communications, and fateful decisions led to fuel exhaustion and likely ditching in rough seas at night. The PBM exploded, probably due to fuel leak and fire, a known vulnerability of that aircraft type. These explanations don't require mysterious forces or unknown phenomena. They require only the recognition that flying over water, especially with malfunctioning equipment and in bad weather, is inherently dangerous, and that mistakes and mechanical failures can have fatal consequences. Modern analyses of the Bermuda Triangle generally reject supernatural or paranormal explanations. Skeptical. Investigators have examined the claims made in books like Berlitz's and found numerous problems. Many incidents attributed to the triangle occurred outside the supposed boundaries or didn't involve disappearances at all, but rather known sinkings or crashes with recovered wreckage. Some incidents were completely fabricated, never having occurred at all. Others were dramatically embellished, with details added or changed to make them seem more mysterious. The area's reputation can be explained by a combination of mundane factors that don't require appeal to the supernatural. The region has extremely heavy maritime and air traffic, more vessels passing through than most other comparable areas of ocean. More traffic means more opportunities for accidents, simply through the law of averages. It's like noting that more car accidents occur on busy highways than on quiet country roads. This doesn't mean the highways are cursed, just that they're heavily used. The Gulf Stream, one of the ocean's most powerful currents, flows directly through the Bermuda Triangle region at speeds up to 5 miles per hour. This current is capable of quickly dispersing wreckage, moving debris dozens or hundreds of miles from where it initially entered the water, making recovery and identification extremely difficult. A ship or plane that goes down in the triangle might leave wreckage scattered across a huge area or carried far from the search zone, creating the impression of mysterious disappearance when the reality is simply that the debris is somewhere unexpected. Sudden storms can develop with little warning in this region, particularly in summer and fall when tropical systems form. A ship or aircraft caught in a sudden severe storm might go down before being able to send detailed distress messages, again creating the impression of mysterious sudden disappearance, when the reality is rapid but entirely natural disaster. The combination of warm water, atmospheric instability, and the Gulf Stream's heat transport creates conditions favorable for quick storm development. Compass variations due to the area's position relative to magnetic north can cause navigational confusion for those unprepared or unfamiliar with the phenomenon. The agonic line, where magnetic north aligns with true north, passes through the Bermuda Triangle. This means compasses can behave in ways that seem strange to pilots or navigators, expecting normal magnetic variation. However, this is a well-understood phenomenon that trained navigators know how to account for. So it's unlikely to cause problems for competent professionals, though it might contribute to confusion in situations where other factors are also causing difficulty. Human error, which occurs everywhere in human endeavors, can be particularly unforgiving at sea. A mistake on land might be embarrassing or costly. The same mistake over open ocean can be fatal. Navigation over water requires constant attention, careful record-keeping, awareness of weather and sea conditions. A pilot or navigator who becomes distracted, who makes incorrect assumptions, who fails to cross-check instruments and observations, can become lost surprisingly quickly. And once lost over open ocean, with no landmarks visible, finding the way back to safety becomes exponentially more difficult. The U.S. Coast Guard, which is responsible for maritime safety in American waters, including the Bermuda Triangle region, has officially stated that the area is not particularly more dangerous than any other region of comparable size and traffic volume. Their records show that the incidence of losses in the triangle is not statistically unusual when adjusted for the heavy traffic the area receives. Most disappearances that have been attributed to the triangle can be explained by conventional causes, storms, equipment failure, human error, navigational mistakes, or in some cases, deliberate acts like insurance fraud or smuggling operations gone wrong. But statistics and official statements rarely dispel legends once they've taken root in popular imagination. The human mind is drawn to mystery, to the possibility that the world contains phenomena beyond our current understanding. The Bermuda Triangle, whatever the statistical reality of its danger, remains fixed in popular culture as a place of mystery and unexplained disappearances. It appears regularly in documentaries, books, films, and television shows. It's referenced in popular music, in video games, in casual conversation when anything goes missing. Flight 19, whatever the real explanation for its loss, continues to serve as the Triangle's most famous story, repeated and embellished with each new generation of mystery enthusiasts. The 5 Avengers that took off on a December afternoon in 1945 have become eternal symbols of the sea's mysteries, of the thin boundary between the known and unknown, of the possibility that our oceans still hold secrets we haven't uncovered. Over the decades since the disappearance, various expeditions have searched for Flight 19's wreckage, driven by a mix of historical interest, desire to provide closure to families, and hope that finding the aircraft might solve the mystery once and for all. In 1991, a National Geographic expedition investigated a promising sonar contact off the Florida coast, a set of anomalies that might have been aircraft wreckage. The expedition deployed underwater cameras and examined the site, but ultimately concluded that what they had found was not Flight 19. Remained unclear. In 2013, the History Channel funded an extensive search effort that located wreckage of TBM Avenger aircraft in the waters east of Florida. Initial excitement suggested this might finally be the discovery everyone had been hoping for, the resolution of a 68-year-old mystery. But subsequent investigation, including examination of serial numbers on recovered parts, determined these were not aircraft from Flight 19, but rather other Avengers that had been lost in different incidents. The ocean off Florida claimed many aircraft over the years, and the Avenger was a common type, so finding Avenger wrecks doesn't necessarily mean finding Flight 19. Other searches have been conducted over the years, some official, some by private individuals or groups. Each promising sonar contact raises hopes, but so far, none has proven to be definitively linked to the lost flight. The wrecks that have been found in the general search area have either been identified as other aircraft or remain unidentified but without clear evidence connecting them to Flight 19 specifically. This absence of wreckage is frustrating but not unprecedented or inexplicable. The ocean is vast beyond easy comprehension, covering more than 70% of Earth's surface. It's deep, with average depths of over 12,000 feet and trenches that plunge to more than 30,000 feet. It's dynamic, with currents that move constantly, storms that reshape the seafloor, sediments that bury what settles on the bottom. Finding anything specific in the ocean is extraordinarily difficult even with modern technology. Aircraft that ditch at sea often sink quickly, especially if they break apart on impact with the water. The Avenger was a heavy aircraft not designed for water landings. When it hit the ocean surface, particularly in rough conditions, it would likely have broken apart, perhaps sinking in pieces, scattered across an area that might span hundreds of yards or more. Once on the bottom, the wreckage would begin to corrode in salt water, to be covered by sediment, to potentially shift position as currents and storms moved across the area. The search area, while extensive in the various search efforts, covered only a fraction of where the aircraft might have gone down. Given the uncertainty about their final position, Flight 19 could have been anywhere within hundreds of square miles of ocean when fuel exhaustion forced them down. Without knowing exactly where to look, finding 5 aircraft, even 5 large aircraft, in that vast area becomes like finding 5 specific grains of sand on a beach. The families of the lost men faced decades of this uncertainty, of not knowing exactly what happened to their loved ones, of graves marked with names but containing no remains, of memorial services for men whose bodies were never recovered. Some family members pursued their own investigations over the years, corresponding with researchers, reviewing documents, trying to understand what had happened, hoping that somehow, someday, definitive answers might emerge. Most eventually came to a kind of peace with the ambiguity, accepting that the ocean would not give up what it had taken. That closure would have to come from within rather than from external confirmation. The passage of time helped in the way it usually does, the sharp edge of grief eventually dulling even if it never completely disappears. Parents who lost sons in 1945 themselves passed away in subsequent decades, taking with them the most immediate and personal pain, though children who lost fathers and siblings who lost brothers carried the loss forward. The 14 men of Flight 19 were young, most in their 20s, with whole lives ahead of them. They had survived a world war, had seen victory over tyranny, had looked forward to peacetime and the opportunities it would bring. Lieutenant Charles Taylor, the flight leader, was 31, married, an experienced aviator who had proven his skill in combat. The other 13 were students or enlisted men, learning their trades, serving their country in what should have been safe peacetime duty. Their names are recorded on memorial plaques, remembered by family members and historians, honored by those who study military aviation history, but their final moments remain known only to them and the sea that claimed them. The 13 men aboard the TBM Mariner were likewise engaged in honorable service, trying to rescue others, responding to an emergency when they met their own end. Search and rescue is among the most dangerous work aviators do, often carried out in the worst conditions, when others are in distress and time is critical, when the impulse to help overrides concerns about personal safety. These 13 died, trying to save the 14, a fact that compounds the tragedy and highlights the courage inherent in search and rescue operations. 27 men, 6 aircraft, all gone in a single afternoon and evening in December of 1945. It was not war, not enemy action. Not combat, just the accumulation of errors and malfunctions and that can turn routine into tragedy. The sea cares nothing for plans or training or experience or good intentions. It takes what it wants and keeps what it takes, indifferent to human grief or the desire for answers. As you continue to relax, letting sleep approach at its own gentle pace, consider the nature of mystery itself. Why some stories capture our imagination, while others, equally tragic, fade from memory. Consciousness, not because the loss was larger or more tragic than other military accidents, but because the circumstances allowed for multiple interpretations. For the possibility of mystery beyond the mundane explanation of navigational error and bad weather, we're drawn to the idea that the world still contains unknowns, that despite our technology and knowledge, there are still boundaries where certainty ends and mystery begins. The ocean represents one of these boundaries, vast and deep and largely unexplored despite centuries of maritime travel. We've mapped the surface, charted the currents, but the depths remain largely unknown, visited by fewer humans than have walked on the moon. Flight 19 speaks to this boundary between known and unknown, between the mapped world and the mysterious. 5 aircraft departed on a routine training flight and never returned, leaving questions that decades haven't fully answered. In that gap between departure and disappearance lies space for wonder, for speculation, for the possibility that something beyond the ordinary occurred. But perhaps the real mystery is not what happened to Flight 19, but why we need mysteries at all, why we're drawn to them, what purpose they serve in our collective imagination. Perhaps mysteries remind us of the limits of our control and understanding, humble us in the face of nature's power and indifference, connect us to something larger than our individual lives and certainties. The story of Flight 19 reminds us how recently navigation was uncertain, how much we've gained in the decades. Since with GPS and satellite communications and computer navigation systems, modern aircraft have redundant systems, multiple backups, ways to know precisely where they are at all times and to communicate that position to others. It's hard to imagine getting lost the way Flight 19 got lost, flying for hours without knowing position, becoming progressively more disoriented while fuel dwindled and options vanished. But the story also reminds us that technology doesn't eliminate risk entirely, that human judgment still matters, that mistakes still happen despite our best tools and training, and that the ocean is still vast and still dangerous and still capable of claiming those who venture upon it. We fly more safely now than in 1945, but we don't fly without risk. The boundary between safety and disaster still exists, even if we've pushed it further out through technology and experience. Let your breathing slow and deepen now, matching the patient rhythm of tides and currents. The eternal movement of the ocean that witnessed Flight 19's end and has kept that secret for nearly 80 years. You need not solve any mysteries tonight. You need not determine what really happened in those final hours, when 5 aircraft burned their last in fuel and went down into darkening waters. Simply rest, knowing that some questions remain unanswered, not because we haven't tried to answer them, but because the answers are beyond our reach, lost in places we cannot follow. The Atlantic continues to flow, indifferent to the stories told about it, indifferent to the legends and speculation and theories. Ships and aircraft cross it daily by the thousands. Journeys completed safely. Arrivals taken for granted. Routine, missions that remain routine, but occasionally, very occasionally, something goes wrong. Someone doesn't arrive. Someone is lost. And if the loss is mysterious enough, if the circumstances are strange enough, if the details allow for multiple interpretations, the story enters legend, becomes more than just tragedy, becomes mystery. Flight 19 flies on in memory and imagination, those 5 Avengers forever frozen in the moment before their disappearance, forever turning east when they should have turned west, forever running out of fuel over darkening waters, forever suspended in that moment when confusion became catastrophe. The men aboard them are forever young, forever on that training mission, forever following their leader into disaster, forever making those final radio calls that expressed confusion and fear and the growing realization that they were lost and running out of time. In museum displays dedicated to naval aviation, in memorial plaques at Fort Lauderdale, in documentary programs and books about aviation mysteries. Them and pass those memories to subsequent generations. Flight 19 endures. Not as wreckage on an ocean floor, not as definitive answers to all questions, but as a cautionary tale, a mystery, a reminder of how quickly the ordinary can become extraordinary, how swiftly routine can transform into tragedy. Sleep well, dear listener, and dream of clear skies and certain navigation, of journeys completed and safe arrivals, of all the flights that return home safely and all the sailors who reach port without incident. Dream of families reunited rather than separated, of telegrams bringing good news rather than devastating notification, of Christmas dinners where all expected chairs are filled. Dream of the ocean giving back what it has taken, though we know this rarely happens, though we accept that some losses are permanent and some mysteries remain unsolved. The Silent Archives thanks you for joining us tonight in contemplating this modern mystery, this disappearance that has never been fully explained, despite decades of investigation and speculation. Years, until we meet again in that quiet space between waking and sleeping, between the known and unknown, between explanation and mystery, between safe harbor and open sea. Rest peacefully. The 5 Avengers of Flight 19, wherever they rest beneath Atlantic waters, whether together or scattered, whether intact or broken into pieces, have become eternal monuments to the risks of flight, to the challenges of navigation over open water, to the thin line between safety and disaster that every aviator walks with every flight. They remind us that technology does not eliminate danger entirely, that experience does not guarantee success, that nature does not bend to human will or expectation, that the sea keeps its secrets well, somewhere in the ocean depths, perhaps scattered across miles of seabed, perhaps resting closer together than we. Imagine in the darkness, where sunlight never reaches. The aircraft and their crews have found a different kind of peace, no longer lost in the sense of searching, because that implies ongoing confusion and fear, simply elsewhere, in a place beyond our reach, holding their secrets as the ocean holds all its secrets, eternal and silent and still. The mystery remains, as it will likely always remain. And in remaining, it reminds us of the vast areas of our world that remain unknown despite our maps and satellites, of the questions that persist despite our best efforts to answer them, of the spaces where speculation and uncertainty still have room to exist in our increasingly measured and documented world. And as we've always said before in other stories, it is ended. Or perhaps it never truly ends. Perhaps Flight 19 continues its eternal journey through the waters of history and legend, always departing on that December afternoon, never arriving at the expected destination, forever suspended in that moment when routine became mystery and mystery became legend, when 27 men became part of the sea's vast collection of secrets for as long as their tale will be told.